Well, good evening, everyone. Happy Saturday to everybody. My name is Brian. Welcome back to Word Wednesday. I hope everyone had a great week. As you can see, I'm not in my typical studio. I did post a video very recently about how by and by, through, I guess, God's grace manifestation, I was able to get a new place. So that's where we are right now. You can see behind me, everything is still in a little bit of both disarray and also a state of sort of empty unfinishedness. So, yeah, it's a work in progress. I've been in my new place for about just a couple weeks now, like maybe 2-3 weeks. So far, it's great, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah, so for those of you that have been watching regularly, thank you so much and welcome back. For those of you that are new to this channel, this whole broadcast is about this one book. It's about the Bible. And we talk about that each and every week, typically and preferably on Wednesdays, but apparently any day of the week, because I guess any day of the week is a good day for the Word of God. Now, today I wanted to talk about, it's kind of a mixed theme, but without giving it an actual title, I'll just jump right in. And as most everybody knows, there's been, because it's not anything new, for decades, I want to say at least the last 50 years, at least the entire time that I've been alive, there has been a on and off, pretty massive ongoing conflict in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians, right? So again, this year, there was escalated fighting, and it's like they call them new wars each time because, you know, they'll come to terms and then it will escalate again. It's historically, it's all the same struggle, but I guess, you know, it's each their own. It's like a new war breaks out however often. And so for those of you that might be watching this video later, at any point in time, this is November 2023. And the other day, just being on my phone as I do when I relax or in between times or whatever, you know, we're all addicted to our phones these days, but I was scrolling through and then I got a notification that it was to be a sensitive video, whatever, on a reel I was about to click on. And I went ahead and clicked on it, and then it was a scene from a bombing that had taken place. A bomb had gone off or been dropped or however, fallen on a hospital wing somewhere in the Gaza Strip. Dropped or whatever by the Israeli militia or army or whatever. So yeah, and it was a pretty graphic scene. You don't really see a lot of these. You hear news sometimes about conflict in different parts of the world, and you can even hear details and numbers, right, and casualties and everything. But to actually see it taped, so someone was on ground right after the bomb hit. Now the portion where they were, I think it wasn't like ground zero where the bomb fell, but it was, you know, however large the effect, whatever this wing, there was bodies that were thrown, and there was a boy, there was several dead children, and there was a boy lying out dead on the side off his bed. It's like images that you can't get out of your head. And there was another boy still in his bed, and he was obviously dead. And then there was a young girl, and she was standing, and she was crying, and she was bleeding. And then the man that was taping the video, he was of course in terror, and he was just showing around everything that was happening. And it really shook me in the moment, you know. And it was one of these. That's the point of this video. There's so much to take from news like this. And so back to my initial reaction, I know that sometimes for me, when I see sensitive content like this or graphic things, it may not even be that it's instant, the full sort of realization of what I'm seeing, but sometimes later on, or when I lay down to sleep, or just later on in thought, like as that image stays, you ponder and all the questions come up, and you feel just a well of emotion. So it was huge for me. And I, again, especially children, right? To see the casualties were just children. I thought about the one boy who was literally just like, strewn on the floor, and obviously his head had been hit because there's blood all over the pavement. And I thought, specifically about him, how by the video, like he couldn't have been more than 10 or 12, so to just see that his whole life was just cut short like that, for what, right? And that's when children are the casualties of war, that's the most senseless part about it, right? So that really, really stuck with me. And first, I think a lot of us, and there's been so many videos that talk about that especially from an outsider's perspective, someone who is not familiar with this word, or who does not know God, that's one of the first questions that we always ask. Why do these things happen in this world? Why is such terror allowed to go on? And that is actually we could do a whole video on that very question. And I've touched on that in other videos, but we may as well do a video on that at some point. But the short answer is that, of course, we are created as free agents. There's no short answer, really, because to go all the way back to Genesis, and I've talked about this in other videos, you see how sin entered the world, and then the fall of man, and then the falling away, right? The closeness that God and man had, and how it just went like this. But then, of course, and then throughout this entire book, God is stepping back in to remedy, and then his children get back to him, and then they fall away, and it's this whole like tug of war and struggle. And then, by and by, 4,000 years after creation, enter Jesus Christ on the scene, and he gives his life, and he gives a full display of the things of God, and he also sheds light on things that would happen before he came again, right? What's known as the second coming. And I'm talking fast, and I'm kind of synopsizing. Those of you that are familiar with this book will know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know, we will get into this more and more. But back to the video that I saw that was so disheartening and disturbing, it is immediately that doubt as to just the value and the worth of mankind, like how we can even stoop to doing these things to each other, right? But that's also what we come to understand from this book. We understand the heart of God, but we also understand the role of evil, and how evil does take such precedence in this world at sometimes, right? And the real struggle, right? I can't remember the reference, but I'll cross-reference in the video, in the description of this video below, how Paul talks about how the real struggle is even unseen, right? Between God's agents and the agents of the devil. But that's played out in the terrors that we see when we don't choose good, right? When mankind does not choose to follow God's way, and the horrors that ensue when we put our own way before anything, and we don't value the things that God has created, and we don't value each other to the point where we can even carry out atrocities. Now, I do think that also the fact that most of us can see the terror, and even if it causes us to question, right, the fact that we are not on board with it does show that, for the most part, most of us have goodness and kindness in our hearts, right? If it hurts you, that's a good sign, right? If you see something that's not right and you feel that it's wrong, that's God's Spirit in you telling you, right? It's just in us innately. It's just telling us this is not right, right? And then we also hope for change, and we wonder if things can even be made right, and if so, when. These are all questions that we constantly have. And even as someone who really, by being pretty familiar with this book, I have the answers to those questions, right? We could go back and go through them one by one, and I can pull out the answer from this book. But it didn't necessarily make it less hard for me to witness, right? The impression, it's still just as terrible, right? To realize that this is the state of the world. Thankfully, not the whole world, but that these things even go on at all. But I wanted to touch on a little bit of that, just to say that from the biblical perspective, we are actually living in a very significant time. And Jesus, when he walked the earth, his disciples asked him, because he had already given indications that after he left, there was a time that he would be returning. And they asked him what would be the signs. And it's throughout the New Testament, but the 24th chapter in the book of Matthew is a very descriptive, clear-cut message and documentation of that conversation that Jesus had with his followers. And the part that applies to this specific war that I was looking at on Instagram is let's first go to verse 3. Matthew 24, you can turn there if you're with me. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? And then Jesus goes into different details, a lot of different things we would see happening. But then he says in verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Verse 7, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. So, of course, even during the time that Jesus walked the earth, that was the time of the nation of Judea, or what's later known as, or Israel, or whatever it was called, was occupied by Rome, as was most of the known world, at least in that area. So, and before then and after then, and there was, the terror and war has just been a part of history, right? So it seems like this might be a little bit of a vague thing for Jesus to reference as part of something to even notice, indicating that he would be coming back again. But it's almost like, I feel like it's pretty obvious that we are in that time that he's talking about specifically, because you see how the technology behind war has developed and how widespread conflict can be and how things can quickly escalate into, a terror situation just by way of how, the weapons and the bombs and everything that's available because of technology, because of the time that we live in. All these things are heightened, right? And I think that's what Jesus was talking about. But it will make more sense if you go over the chapter fully, because when you combine all the different things that he was talking about, you come to realize that pretty obviously he's talking about the time that we're now living in. But yeah, so I had to remind myself of that when I was sort of witnessing closely the picture of that terror, that this is what Jesus said would take place before he would come back and set things right in this world. But then, I guess the part that we can take comfort in, because it can be both disturbing but also scary and worrisome for all of us. It's like, well, what hope is there for the world? And again, maybe this is sounding a little bit dramatic, but I think if you had seen this video that I saw, you would be feeling some of these same things. But then if we turn to Psalm 91, we have to remember that God is still who he always was throughout, and whatever we see happening in this world, whatever happened and whatever will happen, whatever is happening, that doesn't change who God is and who he was. And it's up to us to get back to him. And even if it looks like at this point in this world, it's pretty much gone too far for that, because there's so many differing opinions and religions and ideas, and so it's almost like, is everybody just going to turn and just stop what they're doing and just turn to God? Well, no, and that's why Jesus talks about how the Bible tells us clearly that there is going to be an interference, like completely from outside of mankind, from God himself to actually come back in person, whereas he is already with us, right? He's everywhere. But to where he can be seen physically, and his presence is like the whole kingdom of heaven is going to be part of what we see on earth, and there's going to be basically a takeover, and God is just going to put a stop to the things that we see happening now. Because that's the only way that this world can be restored, if you actually stop and think about it. But in the meantime, so let's turn to Psalm 91. In the meantime, we have to continue to realize and understand that God is here for us, and he is with his children, okay? No matter what we see happening in this world. So Psalm 91, the whole entire chapter is very applicable to what I'm talking about now, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a couple passages. Verse 1 says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." So that indicates that if you say a refuge and a fortress, it means that there is obviously evil to flee from, right? And you're trying to get away from some kind of doom or disaster or danger, right? Otherwise, the passage would have been, there's other passages of praise about, the goodness of God and his presence and how he's, we read that in Psalm 23, right? How the Lord takes care of his children, but this is specifically how the Lord is a protector, and, so to protect us from terrible things that we see happening on the world around us. Verse 5, "You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday." That reminds me of COVID. Verse 7, "1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you." Verse 9, "If you make the Most High your dwelling, even the Lord who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you." Okay? So, and verse 11, I'll continue. This will be the last one. "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." So there we have it. That's the true and really only area where we can really take comfort, is in knowing that God is above all of this, and that he has the ability, and he is wanting to and waiting to and promising to protect his children throughout all of this, right? So we just have to lean on him. So and then another thing I was thinking too, and I read or I watched a video. I can't remember if I read it on the internet or I saw it on YouTube or somewhere, but it was in a podcast. They were talking about how mankind now, through the age of like the internet and whatever media, we have access to everything that is going on around the world at any time, without, of course, the ability as an individual to do anything about it, let alone to do anything about, all the wrongs that we see happening in this world. And that's unlike any other generation before, right? So it can be very overwhelming and stressful for anybody living today if you get into all this. That's why a lot of times people will say, okay, well, I just choose not to look at the news, or I don't look at it much, or whatever, because it's very overwhelming. And this is not something that we were created to even be exposed to, like we are today, right? If you think about it in times past, people had their individual communities, or their village or town or small city or whatever was happening, and that was kind of what you dealt with. That's all you knew until you were to travel somewhere else or whatever. But nowadays, not so. We can, we're exposed to absolutely everything. And that can be a little bit daunting for sure, or very daunting. So I remember after I saw that video, and my first initial reactions and just that really heavy heart I had about it, I in light of, what I just said about not being able to do anything about the problems that we see, well, I remember that there's power in prayer, right? And that if God walks with us, we have the ability to communicate with him and also to come to him about anything. So that's what I chose to do. I just started praying for the people, the Palestinian people, the people of Israel, that they would be able to resolve this conflict and that they would find peace, right? And it seems, a very small prayer for a big situation, but if everyone, I believe that God is listening, and I believe that there is power in prayer by a dynamic that we may not even understand, but it's a magical recipe, if you will, that I can't even explain, but I know that, and I believe that if everyone that was exposed to that footage would say a prayer for these people, if we would hold them in prayer around the clock, I believe we would see change come quicker, because we'll do a whole nother class on prayer. But so I knew in that moment, it gave me just at least a little bit of faith that was something that I could do to help those people, right? Small as it might seem. But again, I'm going to go back to the book of Matthew, and I'm going to share another promise that also reminds us that God is with us, because Jesus specifically, before he left this world the first time, his disciples asked him about that. They were basically as good as saying, they said, Lord, don't leave us. Like, we need you. This world is dark. The world is growing dark. What are we going to do without you? And he said, so we're going to go to Matthew 28, verse 20, which is actually the very last passage in that book. This is after Jesus commissioned his disciples to continue what he started, and he promised that the Holy Spirit would be with them. And he said, and surely, this is Matthew 28, verse 20, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Okay? So he's saying, from then all the way till now and beyond, Jesus will always be with us. So we can take comfort in that too. But just to touch on, and again, like I said, we can do a whole other class on this, but to touch on, we have a glimpse into, and what gives us the faith and the knowledge that at some point, all of these, especially in relation to war, but the terrible things that we see happening in this world, we can know that they will one day come to a stop, because God has promised, and he's told us in his word, through the prophets and through Jesus' words directly delivered to us, there were all these different clues and promises speaking of a future time when God would restore the world to as he originally wanted it, which makes sense because it's his creation, and eventually he's going to want it to be what he started it out to be. But if you turn to the book of Isaiah, 2nd chapter, 4th verse. So that chapter is called the Mountain of the Lord, and in verse 4, this is talking about our future, what we can look forward to as humanity. Verse 4: He, being God, will judge the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. Right? That's what I was talking about. Not just how we have the ability that we can't seem to really manage, because, like I said, there's so many different peoples and nations in this world, so to get everybody on the same page is not very likely, but eventually God is going to come down and be the judge. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So, yeah, that's God's word, and that's what is promised for our future. When exactly we'll see that take place, we don't know. If that's going to be, decades from now, or centuries from now, or millennia from now, but at least we know that God is at work, and he has a plan that, that is at work, and it's going to come to pass at some point. So, and then from there on, there will be an amazing age. But yeah, So that's kind of what I wanted to bring, what I wanted to talk about today. Just comment below if you have been watching the news lately and might have been seeing something that was disturbing to you or made you wonder about, whatever reaction it, invoked in you. But if it made you specifically wonder about the power of God or the goodness of God or the destiny of mankind or whatever, or if it made you think, where do I stand in all this? That's what I love about the Word of God, is that it gives us the perspective by the knowledge of certain things that are unchangeable, right? So that's kind of that. I guess I'll close there. But if you gain value from this video, please help us out and hit the like button. Share this video. You may know others who are experiencing something similar or who might need to hear this word today. Subscribe. We post videos every week, so definitely hit that subscribe button and the notification, and you will know immediately whenever a new video is put out. I want to thank each and every one of you again who are here today with us, and I pray that you will have a beautiful weekend and that you will join us again next week.